Okay, now we're going to go over the different kind of balance that is called asymmetrical balance, which is kind of like the opposite of symmetrical. So it's basically the left and right sides are not the same. So if you were to draw a line down the middle of it, the sides would not be the same. And despite this, it can still have a balanced look to it. So we'll take a look at an example. That's the best way to kind of figure out what I'm talking about here. So we're going to look at this piece by Edgar Degas, Jockeys Before the Race. It's from 1878 through 1879. Oil, essence, gouache, and pastel. So this is kind of an extreme case of dynamic balancing or asymmetrical balance. In this case, it's a mixed media piece. And so the center of gravity is definitely on the right of this piece because the pole that runs through it is there, and also we have a large figure of a horse with a man on it, and there's even a figure here that's slightly off to the right. So definitely the balance, the visual balance, is definitely swayed to the right side of this piece. It's definitely heavier on the left, as we might put it. And at first glance, our attention is drawn to the nearest and largest horse here. And then our eye moves to the next horse and the next horse, and then this vertical line and up into this sun shape. And all of these elements in this painting help to make it successful. If we were to remove one of these elements from this painting, it would just not be as successful. So if we cover up the sun, if we try to, cover this up, maybe just use your hand, you can see that the nature of the painting changes. And it's just not as interesting to look at. And if this was perfectly symmetrical, it would actually be a bit static, a bit boring. There wouldn't be as much dynamicism in the composition. So, and the way that our eye moves around the piece, you can see, so his sight line might move, and the direction of the horse's head might move our eye here to this line, which leads it up here, which might bring it back down to these figures. We might come down here again. This pole is also, this shape of this pole is mimicked here. So there's a lot going on with this piece, and it's definitely asymmetrical, but it still has a balanced look to it. It's not too heavy on one side. It's not too light on the other. Moving on to the next principle, emphasis and subordination. So emphasis is used to draw attention to a particular area. A specific spot or figure is called a focal point. And there's various ways to create emphasis. So we can use position, contrast, color intensity, and size. So we're going to actually just go into that, talking about emphasis here. And we're still going to use the same painting that we used before, Degas' Jockey Before the Race, to kind of talk about emphasis. So this painting uses size, shape, placement, and color to create areas of emphasis away from the center. So the sun is a separate focal point created through contrast. So it's definitely lighter than the surrounding sky, and it's also the shape of it. So the shape of this circle, it's definitely almost a perfect circle, where no other shapes in this piece are circles. So that also helps to kind of set it apart and make it a focal point. And through placement is the only shape in that part of the painting. So the placement is also helping to create a focal point here. So color, shape, and placement are all helping create a focal point there. The sky and the grass areas are muted in color with almost no detail. So they are subordinate to, and thus supporting the areas of emphasis. So, very little detail in the sky and grass, which helps to create emphasis in the more detailed areas, such as the figures and the horses and that kind of thing there. So they're subordinate to the areas of emphasis. So let's talk about directional forces next. Sorry, I had to pause the video there. So directional forces. As with emphasis and subordination, artists use directional forces to influence the way we look at art. So directional forces are paths for the eye to follow, provided by actual or implied lines. So the direction of lines can actually produce sensations. So a vertical line can give the sensation of standing still. So here's a vertical line. It almost looks like a standing figure in a way. A horizontal line can give the sensation of being at rest. So almost looks like a bed. And a diagonal line is dynamic and it creates a sense of motion, and it's a little bit more interesting in some ways. So here's a piece that we're going to take a look at that uses directional forces. Francisco Goya's Bullfight. And this is, he uses, some diagonal lines. He's using some horizontal and vertical lines as well. And this is called Bullfight, plate 20 from 1815. And I think I believe it's an etching with aqua tint. So this is an example of effective design using directional forces. So Goya was able to isolate the man and bull as dark shapes against a light background. He created a sense of crowding into the upper left corner because of the crowd here. And he invoked a sense of motion by placing the bullfighter exactly on the directional axis that runs from lower left to upper right. So if we go here, we can go from the lower left to upper right hand corner here, and he's on that directional line. And he kind of reinforced that feeling by putting the bull's hind legs on that same line. So you can see that bull's hind legs go on that same line. And he placed the man's hands at the intersections of the image's most important horizontal and vertical lines. So we have this horizontal line created by the pole. We have vertical line created by a pole. Horizontal line here from the edge of the stadium here. And his hands are right at those intersections of those horizontal and vertical lines. And then Goya also extended the bull's shadow to the right to create a relatively stable horizontal line. And the man is actually looking down at the shadow, creating a directional force that causes us to also look. So once again, using those sight lines as an implied line. And really, it does reveal the underlying structure of a triangle. So I think if I do this, we can kind of see some of the different lines and directional forces that are, present in this piece. So the dynamicism of the man's diagonal axis is so strong that the composition needed additional balancing elements. So he added an area of shadow in the background that helps to add visual weight and stability to the left of the painting here. So that's probably why there's this darker shape here. So kind of an interesting, you can see all the directional forces, and even this, his front legs are kind of the bull are going in the opposite direction of his left, back legs. So it's actually creating a little bit of a balance there. And then you can see even more lines coming off of the bull's front legs. And then there's that triangle that's being kind of implied, and it's all directional forces, some diagonal lines, some horizontal lines. Okay, so repetition and rhythm. The repetition or regular recurrence of visual elements can give a composition unity, which we kind of talked about earlier in some of the other pieces that we looked at. Continuity, flow, and emphasis can be created through repetition as well. So, interior of a Dutch house that we looked at earlier is also organized around the repetition of rectangular shapes, like we talked about before, which help create unity. And Going Home by Jacob Lawrence, which is the one that we looked at, was kind of the interior of the bus, or maybe it's a train, achieves harmony in part through the repeated use of the green seats. So, and that kind of helped to divide up the canvas as well. So we'll talk about pattern, because we're talking about repetition and rhythm right now, so pattern actually has a lot to do with that as well. It's a pretty big way of creating repetition and rhythm is by adding pattern. So pattern refers to an all-over design created by the repetitive ordering of elements. So we'll kind of talk about rugs. This is a war rug from Afghanistan from 1990 through 2000, somewhere around there. The medium is wool, and the technique is knotted pile. So for centuries in Afghanistan, weavers have made carpets that include imagery from their lives. And since war broke out in 2001, weavers have begun including imagery of war in their carpets and repeat that in patterns on their carpets. So in this rug, the inside border is embedded with repeated patterns of helicopters, hand grenades, and automobiles. And then we'll talk about rhythm. So rhythm refers to any structure of dominant and subordinate elements within a sequence. So rhythm is created through the regular reoccurrence of elements with related variations. Artists use rhythm as an organizational and expressive device. And the simplest way to create rhythm is by repetition. So here we go. An example of rhythm by repetition. So this is Wallace Berman. It's called Untitled from 1970s. It's basically 4 images done with a Verifax machine, which is an early form of copy machine. So 1970, this is about the time that they're starting to come up with that type of technology, such as copy machines. But the first one that came out was called a Verifax. So in this Untitled collage done by Wallace Berman, Wallace found a photo in a magazine advertisement, and it's basically a hand holding a radio. And he used a Verifax, which is an early form of a photocopy machine, to kind of reproduce the hand, and then he varied the exposure slightly each time. And it could have been a boring piece, but he added variety in the work by changing this little image inside of the transistor radio in each repetition of this image. So that kind of helped to create enough variety to keep it from getting boring. So scale and proportion. Scale is the size relation of one thing to another. Proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole. Scale is one of the first decisions an artist makes when planning a work of art. They basically ask themselves, how big is this going to be? Scale can really affect the way we experience art. Things larger than ourselves can induce feelings of wonder, awe, fear. Whereas small-scale objects can seem approachable and maybe a little bit more likely to be pleasing. So we'll look at this scale relationship diagram. So have you ever noticed when a short person stands next to a tall person, they look even shorter, and the tall person seems suddenly even taller? So if we look at this diagram, the inner circles at the center of both groups are the same size, but the center circle at the right seems much larger. So these are actually technically the same size, but this actually seems larger because of the relationship in scale. It's kind of like that small person next to the tall person. It has that same kind of visual effect. So we'll take a look at some pieces that use distorted size for visual effect. So this is by Cildo Mireles. It's called Southern Cross, 1969 through 1970. It's a wooden cube. So one section is pine and one section is oak. It's very small, 3/8 of an inch all the way around. And it's one of the smallest scale works ever created. And this is a Brazilian artist, Cildo Mireles. I'm sorry, I'm kind of butchering that a little bit. So it's basically 2 tiny joined blocks of wood, less than 1/2 of an inch across. The artist made it to comment on the lack of importance that most people attribute to Southern Hemisphere countries. It is hard to exhibit this work in a museum because it's so small. Many viewers miss it, which is kind of ironic because it's just how people tend to miss the Hispanic community or the Southern Hemisphere countries like Brazil. So it has a lot of symbolism kind of built into it. And I am going to kind of wrap up this lecture for now and continue on in the next video.